Hello, I'm Catherine Liddle and welcome to Media Ring Yarning. Today's guest is Melanie Nepinak Hadley. She's a senior executive and an Indigenous woman who works for the CBC in Canada. So this is an absolute gift to be reaching out to our fellow, peers in Canada. Canada is known, particularly in the Indigenous sector, as an industry that and country that's kicked significant goals with Indigenous programming and content. So I'm really, really excited to be able to talk to her today. Melanie, hello, how you doing?
Anin, Indigenous Makwa Dodem. Hello, my name is Melanie. I'm a Bear Clan. Greetings from Treaty 1 territory here in Canada. What a great intro. When you started to say stuff like Indigenous people in Canada are, like moving the dial, I was like, oh, so nice to hear.
Oh, yeah, we're always looking for inspiration. And I'm so glad that you introduced your territory, because one of the other things that we do on this country is we acknowledge the territories that we're currently on. So if you look behind me, it may be really obvious that I'm sitting in a hotel room in the middle of Australia in a place called Coobapedy. So Coobapedy is situated on the Pinjarra lands, which is, for my family, one of the, sort of sister groups. So we are Yankunytjatjara. My nana's side is Yankunytjatjara, and the Pinjarra, as you can hear in the similarities of the languages, that's how they sit together very, very closely. Anyhow, so it's always a really important, as part of that, is that I say hello, and I acknowledge all the ancestors that might be around me and the ancestors from all the lands that we'd be looking in. So, and again, we're acknowledging your ancestors and traditional owners on your country as well. Anyhow, speaking of that, I noticed in the introduction, obviously, we acknowledge your middle name, Nepinak, and it also has an association with your traditional grounding. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
For sure. It's actually Nepinak is a anglicized version of Nipina Makwa, which really means summer bear. And it's interesting when you go back. I'm lucky enough to be able to go back in my family tree, and I'm like, where did this start? When did this happen? And it is the first one, I believe, is John Nepinak. So I can't help as a storyteller, but imagine how that went down. And I imagine, it's a dark history here in Canada. As you know, we have a shared history in that regard. But it's like, I imagine them sort of saying, Nepinak, let's just give him the first name John. You know what I mean? Because a lot of people in the community at that time were given very, very similar and biblical first names. So it is an anglicized version of Nipinamakwa, which means summer bear. And the name Summer Bear is actually the name of a dance troupe that my family has, that kind of came from dealing with racism in our community. I'm currently sitting in my childhood bedroom in Winnipeg, Manitoba. That used to be a predominantly white community, and growing up, we faced a lot of racism. And my parents had this epiphany where they were like, "We're going to put on a mini powwow, and we're going to educate people about what it means to be Anishinaabe," and which just means people. And when they did that, the school next door called, and the school down the street called, and then a conference called, and then a business called. And 30 years later, my parents are still doing that. They have a organization called Summer Bear, and they do cultural teachings and language classes. And it really hardwired me to see the value and how lucky I am to be born Ojibwe.
I'm so glad you shared that, because one of the core principle of Media Ring is to get people together who are interested in finding employment pathways for Indigenous Australians, and looking at, where are the positions available and how do we do it? And certainly, me as an Indigenous person, when I look at that, I think of a bigger picture. I think, yes, there's jobs within your agencies, but there's also industries outside it, and how can you complement it? And that's absolutely a fantastic example of those industries that, I guess, can wrap around and support any one of our allies who are really interested in building the cultural capacity of their organisations. Tell me, do you have anything like a media ring in Canada?
Well, we do have, advocacy groups like the Indigenous Screen Office, but a lot of the work, I think, in terms of connecting talent with opportunity here exists with, interestingly enough, like I think festivals and arts organizations. I know for myself, I worked at an Indigenous or broadcaster at Aboriginal People's Television Network. That's where I became a network executive. And they're just like, we have no choice. We have to hire Indigenous people. So they were just like willing to hire Indigenous people in some scenarios, regardless of maybe what their track record was or what their experience was. And it was such a great place to see how to build capacity in a meaningful way. But then coming to CBC, you know, it's a crown corporation. It's existed for 83 years. It functioned without Indigenous people, without BIPOC people, without people with disabilities for so long. So now, when I first came to the network, I was really trying to connect people that were already working in the community to opportunities that had predominantly been held by white people at the network. And I found myself relying on arts organizations because a lot of the arts organizations were doing that for a lot longer there than we were on the TV and film side. I can think of a lot of the best artists or most established artists, and there are people who were visual artists and there are people who were novelists. And then I was kind of tapping those resources to see what are those people I could bring over. So they're not quite like what you guys are doing. I had a chance to take a look at, and you guys are doing something that is, it's a bit different, but I think that they've served similar purposes, it feels like.
I want to pick up on something you said a little bit earlier there, really around, and essentially points to the fact that, institutions are a form of colonialism. They're a construct of that. And I think at this moment in time where we're seeing the emergence of the Black Lives Matter campaigns, and certainly it's something here in Australia that resonates very, very loudly because our media actually grew out of the Royal Commission into Black deaths in custody, and our numbers of people who die in custody per capita are alarmingly high. In fact, I think some of the highest in the world. So it's an interesting construct because I know anyone on this call or watching this call has an inherent desire to help us, and is also usually cautious around understanding, well, how do I avoid institutionalized racism, and how do you do that in an environment where just by having floors and walls and ceilings, you actually that is a form of systemic institutionalized racism. People don't necessarily identify, but it genuinely exists. So how do you help, now that you're sitting in that mainstream executive space, how do you help, I guess, deconstruct that or support people or even make the space more culturally safe?
I mean, I'll be very honest with you. I am covered in battle wounds. I think that it's not an easy task. It is something that is, I always say I'm walking into CBC some days and I'm so excited because I get to work with Indigenous storytellers and elevate their stories and give them a megaphone. But at the same time, there's the news side of the network. And the news side is what's largely shaped the image of Indigenous people in this country. And not just Indigenous people, Black people, people of color. So, and it's a negative narrative. So I'm like, oh, this place it's such an incredible opportunity, but at the same cost, it's like a slap in the face sometimes. So I do have these complicated feelings about working for a colonial organization like this. But I will say one of the best things that working in this environment has taught me is not only how to be an ally to other equity seeking groups, but how to promote allyship with my white coworkers. Very recently, we were in we're all living in a post George Floyd world, right? And it's a really delicate time. And I found myself having a conversation with a director on our team that I said, I thought we had this conversation. I thought I onboarded you. Like, I thought we did this. And the most powerful thing to me was when one of my co-execs stepped up and said, this is what she told us. This is what she said. And I got to sit back and be like, oh my gosh, I don't have to carry the burden of diversity anymore. They're not looking to me for all the answers. So I think when you're entering into a colonial structure, these big corporations that, from a very basic standpoint, compromise our indigeneity, the best thing you can do is find allies so that you are not doing all the heavy lifting. If I had to do all the heavy lifting, I would not have survived. And the desire I have to change the television landscape, I wouldn't be able to realize that, right? So I'm like, you know what is more important to me? It's not necessarily to be doing what I thought I was going to come here and do, which is change the structure, but to within the structure, change those people's minds and educate them. And also put their feet to the fire about educating themselves. At one point, with my direct manager, I said to her, I'm not going to do this with you. I've already done it with you. And I said to her, this is not easy for me to say to you, but I'm tired of having to explain the nuances of systemic racism to you. So I'm telling you that what you're saying is problematic. And now I need you to go and educate yourself about it. And that is not a situation you want to be in with your manager. But we had built a level of trust, and I had put in that onboarding work where I felt like I could hold them accountable. So it's allyship, it's accountability, and it's taking care of yourself. Those conversations, that's largely also why I'm in Winnipeg right now. I thought to myself, I'm doing this heavy lifting. It's hard on the heart. I'm in Toronto, which is a big city. And I just thought I need to go back to my parents' house where it's chaos every minute and fill my cup so that I have that emotional and spiritual strength to keep doing this and to keep hoping to try to move the dial in some way.
Melanie, I want to pick up on what you said about how your manager stepped up and spoke for you, and what a relief that was, and the fact that you're covered in you've got some battle scars, because certainly that is the position of Aboriginal managers. I know that myself, and I know that from my peers, is that you take some really, really big hits because you're stuck, aren't you? You're stuck in the middle of this really tightly picked onion, and you know that there are certain layers that you have to work with underneath it. That are above and below you, and at the moment you cut them, the whole structure falls away. So, can you describe? I mean, that feeling of relief? I was just resonating with you because it is just so wonderful when someone else steps up and speaks. Because does it always have to be us? Do you have? Is there a particular person that's helped you do that?
Well, it's interesting because as I was saying, I'm like, I'm actually missing one part of that enabled that moment to happen. And it was, we had already had a meeting where I was out on my own, basically explaining inequality in a very basic way. And I said, this is crazy. I can't believe I'm having to explain this again. This is crazy. And then when it was over, I went, it actually wasn't my manager, it was another co-executive. So her and I are at the same level. And when it was over, she was like, oh, that was a very uncomfortable call. And I had said to her, you know what would have made it like less uncomfortable if I wasn't the only one explaining these things about racism. If I wasn't the only one doing it, it may have been less uncomfortable. So I had to actually highlight a moment in which they could step up and exercise their ability as an ally. And I had to point to it like that was the moment you could have stepped in and said something. And I wasn't chastising her. I just said, like, if you feel like you can step up, it does lessen the load and makes it so it's not just one person, trying to get blood from a stone in some ways, right? That's extreme, but you get me. And when she identified it, then when we found ourselves in a similar scenario, she was like, oh, this is the cue. Like, this is the moment. And then she stepped up. And I will say that I have started to say two things. One thing is you have to be kind to allies and you have to be kind to yourself. So when she stepped up, I was like, I have to go and tell her that that was the right moment. And the moment that it happened was such relief. But I think the bigger relief was circling back around with her afterwards on our own and saying, oh my God, now my dog's going crazy. And saying, thank you so much. What you did and when you stepped up in there had such relief for me. And it was an emotional experience. It was an emotional exchange. And she was like, I felt like the right moment, like to communicate just really the pragmatic act of what it means to be an ally, I think was part of it. And it was a learning experience for me. And now I've been really trying to figure out how am I an ally within my own community. I'm sure Indigenous people in Australia also feel this feeling of like, we all kind of get painted with the same brush, but we're all so different. We have different you know, struggles, there is things that is universal, but we all have different things going on. So I try to figure out, how can I be an ally within the Indigenous community? And so when I practice this reciprocal communication in exercising allyship with her, I was like, oh, now I'm going to do that with other Indigenous people within our own community when we help each other and lift each other up. And I think that, when I talk a little bit about those battle wounds and stuff, I always tell Indigenous creators that I'm working with, listen, we all think I have this job where I get to have influence in how what gets picked up, and that's true, but you have to you have to be patient with me. And then when you get the opportunity and you're making your show, I'm going to be patient with you, because I'm going to assume that it's not going to be perfect, right? Like anytime someone from an underrepresented community gets an opportunity, they get this immense pressure that it has to be perfect, because we've all been waiting. The community's been waiting, right? So it's about practicing patience, I think.
Yeah, and that's some awesome tips there for, I guess, the people listening to us and viewing us this conversation today. Some really practical tips. So thank you for sharing that. I'm wondering, could you also share with us what you'd recommend to aspiring Indigenous producers or creatives who want to get into the sector? We know that, your story says there was the opportunity, there was the vehicle. And I know my story was because there was a vehicle. Has the landscape changed, and are the opportunities different? How do people get to them now?
I think that there is a change just in terms of now we're identifying white gaze. So we had Indigenous stories in the past, but when you look at them now, you're like, wow, they're really done through a white gaze. They're not done through an Indigenous perspective. So anytime I'm talking with people who want to enter the industry, I mean, first and foremost, I ask them, do you think there's anything else you could do? Like, is there another job? And if they say yes, I say, do that, because this one's real hard, because you're breaking up little pieces of your soul and you're floating them out there, and people get to bat them down. Like it is, that's why I'm a network executive. I don't have the heart to be somebody out there who's telling stories. I'm not strong enough for that. So I always ask first if this is really the job for them, because it's not easy. But then once they say yes, I say, okay, this is something you need to know is true, that the industry needs your voice more than they need you, more than you need them, because Indigenous people have been programmed to feel that they are not worthy, to feel that they are a chance, to feel that they're a risk, and that's not true. Our voices and the stories we have to tell are super important. They're really interesting, and because they've never been told on large scales, they're also super fresh, fresh to the world, not to us. But I always try to say, your instinct is going to be to think that you're wrong or second guess yourself. And you can't. That is actually just a product of colonial society on you as an Indigenous person, specifically Indigenous women. That's just a product of colonization. So I always say, figure out what you want to do in this industry, and have conviction in your voice, because the moment you have conviction in your voice, it's going to come through. And only partner yourself, because the reality is we have to partner ourselves a lot of the times with people outside of our community. And when you make those partnerships, make sure that those people want to protect your voice and value your voice as high as you value it, and value your voice high, because it's going to be hard to convince people otherwise if you value it low.
Uh, on the opposite side of that, we're talking about allies and job opportunities. What would you say to our viewers and listeners today as to how do you want to reach out? You really want to change the culture. You really want to give Indigenous people the opportunity to work in that sector. What would your advice be to potential employers?
Oh, this one is a tricky one for me. It's been one that I'm still kind of chewing and figuring out. And it's interesting because I find a lot of and I love that you asked that question, because a lot of these advocacy groups or equity seeking group organizations that are helping to build capacity and things like that, like Media Ring or any of Indigenous Screen Office here, they often give tools for their community and not for people working with their community. So it's great that you have this contingency of allies that you are talking to as well. And the one thing I've said to allies, I'm still figuring out the best thing, but the one thing I've been saying, I find myself saying a lot, is like, just accept that there's a bunch of stuff you don't know yet. I can use an example of, I was in a pitch last year. It was with me, another executive at CBC, and this woman was pitching. There's this thing in Indigenous culture here in Canada, they're little people. And it's something that is actually, you can see iterations of it in different Indigenous groups. And they have a very big significance in terms of keeping you humble. They take many forms, but they're very real in the community here. And when she was pitching it, the other executive said, okay, well, we're interested in realistic things. We're interested in things that are real. And I was like, "Ugh." I was like, you can't. And in the meeting, we were in this little circle table. I felt my body shift so that I was like on the side of the storyteller. And I was like, you can't say that, because that would be like her being somebody pitching a Bible story to us and us saying, okay, but let's talk about something that's real. Like, you can't discount this belief system just because it's not your belief system. So if you start from a place of, I might not be right, I might not know everything, you are already like on your way to being a good ally. And my other thing would be, do not rely on the people in your life that represent a group that you want to be an ally to. Don't rely on them to give you all your information, because they're carrying a heavy load of living the experience, and having to explain things to you is traumatic. It could be small, it could be very tiny, but it's traumatic nonetheless. You have to take the onus on to go and educate yourself. I love, I'm married to a non-Indigenous man. He's French, which I think is hilarious, just because the history of French Canadians in this country. But he never asks me questions about, he doesn't want to, he doesn't come to me for all the answers. He's actually reading this book right now specifically about Ojibwe people, and he came to me with information that I didn't even have, and I was like, what? But it was such a great moment, because I was like, I love that you've gone out and you're educating yourself, and you're coming to me to check the receipts, so to speak, but you're not relying on me. Like, that makes it, it's such a great, when an ally does that, doesn't rely on you, educates himself, but maybe comes to talk to you about it. That's an incredible position, because you're on equal ground. It's not this thing of, I need you to tell me everything. Like, the dynamic isn't, it's about, you're balanced.
Yeah. So there's two things I want to pick up on, because I know we're running out of time, but
oh God, sorry, I'm such a talker.
No, we love listening to you, and we could talk all day. But I also am married to a non-Indigenous man. He's English by birth, and he loves my family to pieces. And he said to me one day, we were going to a family gathering, and he said, "Oh, is Warren going?" And I said, "Oh, I couldn't tell you." And he goes, "Oh, I'd really like it if he went." And my brain went click, click, click. And I went, "Oh, is that so you won't be the only white person in the room?" And he said, "Yes." And it was an awesome illustration of someone who loves us, is part of our family, but showing that it has helped his understanding of the world to be in a room where you are the only person who is different. And I think, again, that's something of the reason I raise it is I'm sure you resonate with it, and I'm sure, again, it's got some context for our allies. The second point I want to make is that the only reason we've got you here is because of an ally, and that's Michael Carrington, who's introduced us and I guess convinced you to come along and share your story. So, huge thank you to our ally, Michael. And before we wrap up, you're so interesting. I just wanted to give you the opportunity. Is there anything else that you feel you need to share with us about story making, employment opportunities, and what the potential of the world could be?
I mean, I feel like I'm going to repeat myself, but there's this thing that happens in the Indigenous community where a lot of the times as storytellers, we create our own opportunities, or we end up taking a bit of an unconventional path to the roles we have, myself included. And to non-Indigenous employers or to these big corporations, I just want to say, like, we need to figure out a way to value unconventional career paths, because they might not have done the thing that they want to do next, but they probably got the tools to do that, right? So it's how, and I think it goes both ways. I think when I look at Some allies that I've worked with, I actually just talked to one yesterday on the phone, and he had an experience as somebody who was, had a very serious illness. And all of a sudden I could see this connective tissue between us. Like he's, a white man who's been very successful in this country. But all of a sudden, because we had a shared plight in some way, I could see connective tissue. And I thought, I shouldn't discount you as someone who hasn't faced adversity. Like I think I sometimes think that, oh, because he's successful and white and had all this great privilege, that he hasn't experienced adversity, and he has. And that is what connected us. And we actually went from having a bit of a terse conversation to having one of the most meaningful conversations I've had in the last week. So for allies and for people in the Indigenous community, let's not sort of paint things with a broad stroke. We really have to value each other's experience in different ways. It might not be the same as ours, but there might actually be some similarities in it.
Finding the common humanity. Melanie Nepinak Hadley, it has been fantastic to talk to you. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. Oh my gosh, I can't wait to come to Australia. I can't wait to meet anyone who's watching this. I just can't wait.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And thank you all you mob that have joined in. We'll see you next time.